I'm extremely, extremely pleased to introduce my guest to you today because we've had so much confusion regarding what's going on with China, what India's response should be, what India's current response has been, and where that leaves us as a country. Now, there's a lot of very shrill nationalistic things that are being said. Is that good? Is it bad? Is it detrimental to where we are? And how do we look at what has happened on the border right now in Ladakh, vis-a-vis the backdrop of our relationship with China for the last several decades? Now, the voice that can explain everything to us has been kind enough to offer me some time and answer these questions. Mr. Jayadeva Ranade is the president of the Center for Chinese Analysis and Strategy. Now, I want to take a minute to just introduce this gentleman to you. He's a former additional secretary of the Cabinet Secretariat of the Government of India. He's a specialist in security and intelligence. He's a seasoned China analyst with over 25 years of experience on the field. And I can tell you, everyone I spoke to said this is the final word and the final voice on China. He's earned, he speaks the Chinese languages fluently, and he also served in the Indian Embassy in Washington as well. Mr. Ranade, I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you were kind enough to join me this afternoon and answer all of the questions that I have and my audience has sent out for me. So first of all, thank you for giving us your time. My first question to you is simply going to be this. It seems to be now that the Galvan Valley incident was not a one-off, that this was part of a larger, perhaps plan or strategy that China was executing. In your understanding, what could that final or the larger strategy have been on the Chinese side?
Firstly, Faye, thank you very much for inviting me to your show. It's a pleasure to speak to you, and through you to your audience, who I understand are slightly younger than me and others. I look forward to trying to explain things to them. As you said, certainly what we are seeing across our line of actual control today is quite different from what we have seen in the past. And there are two reasons why I would mention. One, it stretches almost or slightly over 1,100 kilometers along the length of the line of actual control from Daulat Beg Oldi in North Ladakh to Nakula in Sikkim. Plus, yes, there is perhaps another training base, so-called training base, being established by the People's Liberation Army of China on the borders of Tibet and Bhutan. I'm not aware of what exactly the potential use of this is, but it's coming up, and it's coming up at this time. So it's something that I think would be on the radar of our, at least military planners. Second, I would not really link the developments at Galwan with this massing of forces, for the simple reason that Galwan is one specific spot. And to my mind, if the Chinese were focused only on Galwan Valley and on making a thrust there to cut off our access to Daulat Beg Oldi and the Siachen, then why spread their forces right across the line of actual control? They could have reoriented the forces separately for making a deep thrust here. But the fact that they have massed their forces along 1,100 kilometers, to my mind, suggests that there is a larger agenda. It could be one of two or three things. One, that they are very keen on securing their strategic and financial interests in the wider Ladakh area. When I say wider Ladakh, I mean what used to be Ladakh earlier, which is Aksai Chain, Gilgit, Baltistan, and POK. Let's not forget that the China-Pakistan economic corridor has come up through that area, and the Chinese are keen on securing that. Second, it could be a feint to, before they make a move in the eastern sector, which is Arunachal Pradesh. So I'm just laying out the options to you. Or the third could well be what they decided at their conference on peripheral diplomacy in October 2013, when they designated countries for the first time in the history of the People's Republic of China as enemy and friend. We were not among the friends. The ones who were Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Turkey, etc. But what they promised their enemies or people who are not friends are periods of sustained military pressure. So this could be part of that, but it will be costing them too. So I don't know. I would really look at the fact that they have a plan to test our military responses, our political will, and whether the country hangs together as a whole or not during this exercise. Depending on that, they would probably go for their larger objective either now or step back and come later. Subsidiary to all this is that Xi Jinping, the president of China and chairman of everything, as they call him in China, has invested a lot in the modernization of the People's Liberation Army. A lot of money, a lot of effort. He's virtually changed the entire general staff by putting his people. He's invested a lot. He's also pumped in a lot of nationalism and party ideology into the people of China. So he will be wanting to test the People's Liberation Army, test whether they have actually imbibed all the new equipment, etc. So this could be part of that also. Both the testing as well as what I outlined earlier, the larger objective would entail some kind of a military conflict. So I think we need to be prepared for that.
So, so many questions from that first answer. And if I take them piece by piece, if I may, the possibility of a larger military conflict. And we know right now that India has moved what is called mirroring troops, where we've moved a large number of our troops to that border with China. Do you believe now there's a possibility of de-escalation, or are things only going to get more tense from here?
There are two issues now. One, I cannot say whether they will de-escalate or not, because that brings me to my first question. Why have this massing of forces if you're just going to de-escalate and withdraw without achieving some objective that you had? Second, if he does withdraw, as I just explained to you, Xi Jinping has pumped in a lot of nationalism, etc. People are going to be questioning him. And the fact that he's been under fire since the last party congress, when he abolished the term limits for appointment to top posts, etc., and the mishandling of the coronavirus, he's under a lot of pressure. And the Chinese Communist Party has also been criticized, both perhaps for, I have not seen it in so many years, personal criticism asking Xi Jinping to step down, the Chinese Communist Party being criticized by people who have risked putting their criticisms on the social media in the sure knowledge that they will be traced and punished, which of course happened. So withdrawal for him also involves a loss of face. So you'll have to find ways of, ensuring that he doesn't lose face. So it's going to be difficult for him to withdraw just like that, unless he can hold up some major concessions given by us, which I don't think either we should or we can.
Well, let me ask you about this test of response. There's been a lot of debate across the country about the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister's statement of the fact that there was no insurgents on our territory. And a lot of people said the Prime Minister has conceded territory to China. China immediately turned around and said, okay, now we're claiming Galwan Valley was always ours. And I do understand that the line of actual control is actually not a border. And it's important for us to understand that this is not a marked out, a fenced in border. So it's difficult to actually tell where it is. But as far as strategic communication, or STRATCOM as you call it, is concerned, did we get this right? Or was this a statement of meekness? How should we understand this as citizens?
Again, I hate to sound like Chinese, but 2 points. Firstly, Aksai chain has always been ours. We have not given that up to the Chinese. So when we talk of LAC and Galwan Valley, they're all very much ours. Only thing is now they're an occupation of the Chinese, and so we have to negotiate them. Second, you made a very valid point about the Chinese having claimed Galwan. So let me clarify that. The claims were made first on the 17th of May through the Global Times, which said that the whole of Galwan, China has exercised sovereignty over the entire Galwan Valley for a long time. They also made a subsequent claim, I think it was the 18th of May, on the entire region of Ladakh. That also belongs to China. They first made that claim in April 2013 when there was an intrusion at Depsang Plains. I think the Prime Minister's statement was probably, strategic communications has not been a strong point as far as India is concerned. I think have not been able to, if I may use a term, use the media or manage the media in the way we should. So a lot goes wrong. And I think the fact that there had to be three clarifications on the Prime Minister's comment. The first was, of course, his statement. Then there was a PIB clarification. Then the Prime Minister, I think it was a rally somewhere, he made a third clarification himself about, giving back as good as we get, etc. So I think the Prime Minister's intent and determination, I think, is clear. He is not willing to surrender any territory. I think at the meeting of the all-party meeting also, they would have backed him on that. So I think on that it's clear. But communications-wise, certainly we bungled or mismanaged. The Chinese, of course, were very quick to fill the gap. The moment they saw a weakness, they piled in and said, well, we have also said that the Indians intruded into our side of the LAC and have caused the damage. So there is that gap, and I think we certainly need to, strengthen our strategic communications. And we have made this point earlier also. Somehow in government it doesn't seem to translate into.
Mr. Ranade, does this make it difficult for those who are actually in diplomatic talks, or even those at the Lieutenant Governor talks that are taking place as of yesterday? Because when the head of state says, hey, no one stepped into our territory, China is going to turn around and think, but your head of state said that none of us were in your territory. So now it becomes, does this make life a lot more difficult for the diplomats and those working strategically on the ground?
Well, the fact that clarifications were given, I think, eases the pressure on them, because they're going to point to the clarifications and say, well, actually, it was misinterpreted by the quote-unquote mischievous journalists, etc. And actually, what he meant was this. So they've got a way out. Yes, it did cause confusion for, I think, 24 hours throughout our country also.
I do want to ask you this, though. Up till now, in the various instances that we've had post 63 till date, there have always been a sort of diplomatic solutions that were found for Doklam and for the other two incidents that have happened in the past. Is this going to be something that we can unwind diplomatically? Or do you think a larger military exercise at this point is inevitable?
It all boils down to why the Chinese did it. My own reading is that this was coming. There were indicators that the Chinese were unhappy with India. They, like a big power with an old civilizational history of theirs, they feel that others must listen to them, which of course we were not about to. We are incidentally an older civilization, so we have our own traditions. But why did they come? One of the reasons is that once they announced and began putting in place the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, they naturally were concerned about the safety and of their investments, of their assets, and of their nationals who are working on the project. So from that date, virtually, they began telling us at the official level, at the track 1.5, at the track 2, at the level of think tanks and other visitors, and I'm almost quoting here, to start talking to the Pakistanis, ease our tensions, um, resolve the Kashmir issue, and then look to normalize, to improve relations with China. That was the mantra that they came in, almost in quotes, as I said. And they have continued with that policy. I think subsequent to that, when we revoked Article 370 and 35A, uh,
Yes.
we of course did it with Pakistan in mind and for our objectives. And we clarified that, with a map as to where our boundaries would be. Now, the Chinese got, I would say, more apprehensive about what our intentions are, because suddenly their assets and what they had built, including the Karakoram Highway, etc., were now in the crosshairs of the Indian forces or the Indian establishment. So that was another factor why they felt it is necessary to secure their assets. So what are they looking for now? I mean, if they are going to withdraw, are they looking for guarantees from us that we will do nothing to them, etc.? When we struck Balakot, if I may just mention here that airstrike,
Yes.
I
Yes.
think the target was about 30 kilometers away from one of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor projects. So next time it could be even closer, or it could be a project itself. One doesn't know. So I think these are all factors that have gone in to this. So whether they will withdraw on assurances or through a diplomatic talk, it is difficult to say. But here I could mention one point, which is what happened at Doklam. At Doklam, after 73 days of pure vitriol coming from Chinese propaganda, threats every day, we of course kept our cool. But when the disengagement happened, there was a lot of disappointment in China. Uh, Hu Chiu-shen, who is the editor-in-chief of the Global Times, who is a
Yes.
very nationalistic and strident kind of individual, including on his tweets, he, I remember, put out a tweet immediately saying the people of China are very unhappy. I am very unhappy. Subsequently, there were a lot of commentators, military commentators, who have been very supportive of Xi Jinping, who also came out with various comments saying, our army was strong, what happened? We have always felt that India is not really a worthy opponent. What has happened? Why did we get beaten? Why did we not get what we wanted? Etc. But the second day, there was a rumor that swept through China, and rumors are not very common there of this kind, saying that Xi Jinping had promised India 20 billion yuan in order to agree to a disengagement. Now, the seriousness of this, I'll just illustrate it by saying that the People's Daily, which is the official and authoritative party newspaper, published a denial of this rumor. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, their spokesman, he denied this rumor. And the Ministry of National Defense of China, their official spokesman, denied the rumor. So obviously the rumor was pretty strong, but sum and substance, Xi Jinping did get criticized for that. So this time it could be even more. And we don't know how many lives the Chinese have lost. That's another issue that might come up.
Mr. Ali, you did say, of course, I want to come back to that other part of your first answer. You said China separated what they called friends and non-friends or enemies, and India found itself in the second, in the latter category. But our Prime Minister has met with their head of state at Wuhan, then again in Chennai. Media reports, other than about what they ate and what they wore, was also that it went really well. We do a lot of business with China, at least from our point of view, we do a lot of business with China. How is it that we still wound up in the non-friends category? And diplomatically, has there been, an attempt to sort of ease that? Because is that a comfortable place for India to be from a South Asia point of view, to be in that non-friends category?
No, it's not a good place for us to be. We would rather be friends with everyone. And the Chinese keep paying lip service to this formula that, if the two of us get together, we could almost conquer the world kind of thing. which hypothetically is true. But the fact is that we've had strained relations for quite a while. And there are many factors that are responsible. I won't go into them in detail, but let me say that there are mutual suspicions. The Chinese have always been wary about what really we want and we don't want. They have always looked at us as people who are also, with the border issue, that we are not letting go of it. We are not willing to settle it, while we feel that they are not willing to settle it. So there are a lot of tensions in the relationship. And despite the meetings between our Prime Minister and the Chinese President and the leadership, etc., I think we need to separate the hype from the reality. So even as you referred to these two meetings at Wuhan and at Mamalapur, in fact, I wrote about both of them immediately after. And I didn't agree with all the hype at all. I said, there were very limited agenda. And let me give you one example. I think it was at Wuhan where we spoke about the leaders giving strategic direction to their armed forces on how to behave at the borders. Now, in our Prime Minister's case, he is not the supreme commander of the armed forces. He is not the general. He is the Prime Minister, the head of state or executive head of state. As far as the Chinese are concerned, the President of China is also the chairman of the Central Military Commission. So he is directly in charge of his armed forces. And under Xi Jinping, that has become even more integrated because he's also assumed the post of commander-in-chief. So he's going to give strategic directions to whom is the question. Then they have their own system where, so what I mean to say before I go into all that is, when there is an intrusion, it has to be cleared. It's not that they're not aware. Maybe if it's a minor intrusion, the Central Military Commission and Xi Jinping are not informed directly, but otherwise they are. So there are a whole lot of things which go into building a relationship. It is not just bonhomie and goodwill between two leaders. That helps, but it is not the only thing. So I think, and as far as the Chinese are concerned, as far as I know them, they are not swayed by emotions like this. They go by what they think is good for them.
Militarily, and I'm now coming to the third part of your first answer, you talked about the test of Indian response, that the Galwan Valley might have been a test of India's response. There were some articles that were written about the fact that maybe they were banking on the fact that because of COVID, because India traditionally tends to keep an eye on Pakistan more than we tend to keep an eye on our borders with China, that they were hoping to catch us on the back foot. But we've had the leaders of our forces talk about a two-front aggression. We've always been confident of the fact that our forces could give Pakistan a bloody nose if necessary. And our forces are willing and are always ready to take up a challenge, irrespective of where we might be in terms of equipment or in terms of what we have in our arsenal. Do we know what China has in its arsenal? And is a two-front aggression something that India can afford at this point, given where we are economically as well?
I don't think a conflict is something that any country can afford, and certainly not us, because as you rightly said, for us, economic development is the key. It's the main thing. And I think our leadership, whether it was Prime Minister Manmohan Singh or Prime Minister Modi, both have made it very clear that economic development is the centerpiece of their program. So that's very clear. But you spoke about the Chinese and testing our responses, etc. First thing they would have seen is how prepared are we as India for the Chinese advance. And they would have assessed as to when we began responding, which means when did we get the first information about the Chinese getting together and coming here. So, how is it that, for example, I would ask, or you would ask, we got to know that they were here when they were already here. So I think the Chinese would game that in.
Okay.
Second, how quickly were we able to respond to them? How quickly were we able to react? We moved our troops up. we got ourselves deployed. That would give them an idea of our deployment, our readiness, etc. I think they would be checking that out. Third, the fact that we have gone on high alert right across. So I think they would be testing that. Then they would be looking at the political will. And that's important because the Chinese are very adept at playing a psychological warfare game and seeing how the responses are. So they would be looking to see whether we waver or not, whether we are firm or not, whether we are reaching out to others to try and negotiate with them or not. And if we do these things, they interpret them as either signs of weakness or strength. So it's quite important. And the third, the Chinese do believe in force. So someone who's stronger than them, they would be deferential to. And someone who's weaker than them, they would ride roughshod over. I remember asking a friend of mine, and believe it or not, I do have some Chinese friends also. I knew this man pretty well. I still know him pretty well. And I asked him, I said, tell me, forget everything else. Is there any possibility that we would be able to solve this border situation? I mean, so he laughed and he said, there are only two ways we will solve it in China. Either with a stronger power or with a certainly weaker power. So you have to be one of the two. He said, that's when it's going to get resolved. So that is the way they look at things. And I think in the Chinese system, they'll be watching all this, which is why I said, I have maintained that we have to be firm. We cannot show weakness. We cannot take this 2 steps forward and then 1 or 2 steps backward. It sends a wrong signal. And one more thing, just to illustrate my point about how Chinese view strength. When Mao initiated 1962, at that time, he made a comment, I believe, that you slap the enemy down hard enough and he will not raise his head for 25 years. The same thing was repeated by Deng Xiaoping when he ordered the crackdown at Tiananmen in 1989. Same phrase, 25 years. So 25 years are up.
So is that what we have done in your opinion? 2 steps back, 1 step forward, 1 step back. Have we not seemed sure-footed?
I think we've been, historically, if you look at India-China relations, I think we have not been sure-footed. I think we have been appeasing them all along, and that is one of the factors responsible for where we are today. I'll give you an example, not directly related to this, we can come to that later. We have the Tibetans and the Dalai Lama in India.
Yes.
He is, whether we subscribe to Buddhism or not, he's a respected religious figure in India and abroad.
Yes.
Why do we hesitate when our relationship with the Chinese is not all that warm or hot? Why do we hesitate in meeting him publicly? It's because of this, in polite language, sensitivity to the Chinese. Some could call it something else, but it's sensitivity. Similarly, with Taiwan, a purely commercial relationship, Taiwan has a lot to offer in high tech. They have, good shipbuilding, the microchips, etc. We are desperately in need of all those. Why don't we have a commercial relationship with them? It is because of sensitivity of Chinese interests. To my mind, that's, almost 1.5 steps back rather than when we take 2 steps forward. So things like this convey a wrong message. And the Chinese feel that they can push us over. At this time, I'm, of course, waiting and watching like I think most of us are. I was, let me say, it was encouraging to see our reaction at the Depsang Plains, at Khmer, at Doklam. Here also, we need to hold firm because the manner in which this has happened, if we give in or if we are seen to give in, I think it will have consequences for us over the long term.
Mr. Rande, obviously, like you said, there are different layers of responses. There's military, diplomatic, political, and economic. Now, economically, there are, of course, people throwing television sets out of their window, and those people should largely be ignored even by the media, but it's not happening. But should we learn right now to separate the responses, economic responses, from everything else? Because there are MOUs signed by states that are now being drawn back into question. We know that the finance ministry has taken loans from Chinese-backed organizations. Do you endorse the idea of relooking at all of this? Or do you believe these two things should be separate?
I believe we need to have a good, hard, clear-eyed look at our entire policy towards China. As you said, covering the entire range. But let's focus on economics, because that's what you mentioned. The economic aspect, we need to look at very, very closely. And frankly, I've been advocating this even when I was in service. For various reasons, it didn't go through. Though it went up to the highest levels, everyone said yes, then there used to be a snag. You can imagine why. But anyway, what I said was, and what I believe now, even today, we must decide as a country what are our vital sectors in economic terms, in production terms. What are the vital sectors? For example, pharma, now that we are in the midst of COVID, why are most of the APIs, almost 60% or more, being manufactured there, and why do we have to import them? Mind you, at one time we used to manufacture them in India. So why? And here I fault the government. Instead of having layer upon layer of regulatory authority, that authority should have been monitoring this and should have said, look, regardless of whether it's more expensive or not, regardless of whether the price of your drug goes up by $1 or not, you will manufacture at least so many percent here so that our needs are taken care of in times of an emergency. It's a minor thing, but things like that we need to look at. For example, another thing is precision engineering machinery, like power generation turbines, etc. Our private players, who are the ones who are using them mainly, they're buying them from China. Then they're very simple. They get a loan from the Chinese to buy it. The deliveries are quick, and it meets their needs. Now, when they used to buy it from the Indian public sector undertaking, it used to take a long time, etc., for the delivery. So they gravitated there. But again, I'm taking a broader view here. Our public sector undertakings are virtually, shutting down their production lines because they're getting no orders. So who loses? You and me as a country loses rather than them, because we are losing that high precision machining technology with it. So these things are where I think we need to look at and button down. Third, if I may just mention one more, is telecommunications, where it's very important. I don't know which phone you use, but most Indians are using a Chinese phone.
Yes.
We should not blame them. It's cheaper than any other phone. So the bulk of the guys, they say, look, if I'm getting a phone for 1,000 rupees, why should I spend 20,000? And so they will go on to that. But when we are talking about, localization, about manufacturing, surely we can have our own people doing it. But that's not my concern. I'm not worried about the mobile handsets. I'm worried about the data going back. So we should allow handsets by all means, provided their data is stored here.
So what you're saying effectively is, instead of calling for people to boycott Chinese goods, what we should be doing is becoming competitive and improving our system so that we can manufacture and then become self-sufficient.
Yes, and also exclude the Chinese from certain sectors, which I consider critical sectors. Like I mentioned, telecommunications. Anything happens anywhere, let me assure you, whether it's an army person or a policeman or a politician, first thing he'll do is he'll contact the concerned man on the mobile and ask him to do it. Now the mobile, if it's a Chinese mobile, they can monitor it. But more dangerous, Faye, is the fact that 70% of our service providers, like Airtel, Tata's, or whoever these companies are, the backdoor operations are run by two companies, either Huawei or ZTE, both are Chinese. So they can decide actually without any authority from the Home Ministry whom to listen to, whom not to listen to, whom to isolate, whom to cut off. So these are the sectors where I say we need to be careful. The rest, how does it matter if the Chinese sell soap here? It's okay.
Do you believe that the recent sort of noises of aggression from Nepal are cause for concern, or are those one-offs? Is this part of the larger tapestry of what's going on in that area?
Yeah, Nepal is one of the friends, and they have been promised a lot of assistance, financial assistance. They have been promised a lot of infrastructure development through, of course, the Belt and Road. The Nepalese are willing to go for it. They are going to land up in trouble. And I'm not saying that, out of as sour grapes, but they are like the Sri Lankans, like the Pakistanis, because they're going to take loans for huge projects. And there are two things which should strike a person actually. One, why are the Chinese so interested in Nepal? Second, who is the real target? Because Nepal is not an economic attraction for the Chinese or for anyone. It's a very small market. They're looking at us and they're looking at our Northeast and that kind of thing. So that is the real target. Why should they make such an investment in extending the railway line from Lhasa to Shigatse to Kathmandu and then down to Lumbini? Now going through the Himalayas, that is, they're already up to Shigatse and a place called Chirong, which is the customs port from Tibet, where they come into Nepal. It means boring through the Himalayas, and I believe there are about 35 tunnels that are estimated that will have to be constructed or built. Now, it's a lot of money. And the project hasn't got off because the Nepalese have asked the Chinese to conduct the feasibility study. The Chinese have asked the Nepalese to fund the feasibility study because it's very expensive. So it's stuck. But when it comes through, it will be a problem for us. That's just one part. But if you look at the Nepalese, Kathmandu, virtually central Kathmandu is taken over by the Chinese today. They're running all the foreign exchange business, little Chinese, shops, restaurants, etc. So they're running, they're present already. And this drift that we are seeing, political drift now, particularly under Oli, but it started with Prachanda towards China, something that should worry us. I know a lot of my colleagues, a lot of friends say, well, we have such old civilizational links, we are Hindu, they are Hindu, all that kind of thing. Once Nepal gets closer to the Chinese, it may be a bit too late for us to talk about, religion and this and that. Does it really count when it comes to that? So these are factors that I think we need to keep in mind and, brief the Nepalese as to where they are going. And, there are a lot of Nepalese working in India. They're married here, they've got property here, they've got government jobs. Now, if the Nepalese are going to play hardball, someday someone here might decide that, okay, who can play the game? Then what happens? So we have to start, I think, trying to mend the relationship, I would rather.
So you mentioned Sri Lanka. Is there reason for concern in Sri Lanka? And where does that leave us then in our, among our neighbors?
No, I don't think there's a reason for concern in Sri Lanka. I was just mentioning Sri Lanka as an example. Actually, Hambantota was my what I had in mind about how they had to give it. China got a chunk of real estate there. So Hambantota has been given a long-term lease to the Chinese because Sri Lanka could not pay the loans. They're now heading for another problem because a lot of central Colombo is being taken up by the Chinese for construction, etc. When the Sri Lankans are unable to pay, then there will be a problem there. So in that context, I don't think we have a problem with Sri Lanka. I don't think we have a problem with the Maldives. There is going to be competition. We have to face it. We have to realize that we cannot compete dollar for dollar. The Chinese have many more. But there are other leverages that we can use, which we have used with the Maldives, which we have used with the Sri Lankans. We can use it with the Nepalese, where the Chinese are not that adept. I hope we wake
up. As an emerging Asiatic power, which is something that India has sort of had an ambition to for a long time. Does this change any of that? To the
Uh,
events of the last week?
it puts more pressure on us. What is happening on the border today, I think that's what you're referring to.
Yes.
What is happening on the border today, how we respond to it will make a lot of difference. When I mentioned to you earlier in the interview, I spoke about consequences that we will have to live with if we are perceived as being weak or give ground. Um, how will our neighbors look at us? If we give in, they will, to use a very loose phrase, the respect that they may have
Mm.
had,
Mm.
uh, they will feel that we are not that strong or even influential. The world powers who are today looking at us as a possible ally for whatever, whether it's Quad, whether it's a frontline nation or whatever, they will suddenly start having doubts about our capacity to stand up, even without conflict having broken out. One thing is to stand up and fight, and then have someone overpower you. The other is not even to fight. And I think there I would look to Vietnam as a good example of how things are done.
Mm. Mr. Ranade, what is the US's role in all of this, and our closeness to US also being viewed by China? Is there, is that any sort of influence on what's going on at this point?
I think it's one of the factors. It's not a very major factor, but it's one of the factors. The Chinese keep talking about it. It's certainly there. They have huge problems with the Americans at the moment. They're suffering because of that economically, apart from COVID. They're apprehensive that close US-India ties may mean a combination of forces against China. So they're apprehensive of that. But I don't think that is a major factor for what is happening. It's one of the factors. I don't think, for example, that to get back to your question about us, what we are doing, how we have to face up, it's going to be us. I don't think, even if the Americans want to help us, the maximum they can do is supply certain materials that we may need, military equipment, etc. The rest, we would have to do on our own. And from what I hear, I think our resolve in military terms is pretty sound.
Mr. Ranade, the tough talking or the standing up and fighting that you were referring to, could it include trade tariffs against Chinese goods coming into India? Is that a viable option on the table for the Indian government?
I think that's something where, of course, gut reaction would be, yes, we should, impose them. But they'll have to think over many things very carefully. As I said, certain vital sectors, I certainly feel that we need to exclude, in fact, the Chinese from there. But the question is whether we can. After all, we are members of, WTO, etc. And we'll have to look at all those arrangements to see whether you can or India can impose tariffs, without attracting punitive response, either by an international body or something else. So I think that we will have to look at. Also, the second thing is whether we will be affecting our own industry. I mean, maybe some of those imports are essential for our own industries to continue to run. So we'll have to look at that also. We can't just take a blanket ban right now. It's another matter that if we start imposing these tariffs, China may choose to shut off the tap on certain ingredients that we may want. So we'll have to look at all that and then take a calibrated decision.
Is it fair? I mean, it's not nationalistic at this point to say, but is it a fair assessment to say that China has the upper hand as far as trade is concerned between them and us?
Yes, certainly. I think it is fair to say, and I don't see why you're saying it may not be nationalistic. It's the truth. We have a trade where we have an adverse trade balance of almost $50 to $60 billion, which is more than the total amount repatriated by workers in the Gulf to India. So it's a huge amount. And I think it's very skewed, frankly, because a lot of it is raw materials going from here or natural resources going from here. And I wonder at times whether we have factored in what India's needs may be as we modernize and progress. after all, we are at I would say still the arc is still rising for us. Hopefully it will rise much sharper and faster, in which case our needs will increase. As we become more modern, as we become more developed, our needs will increase. And have we ensured that we have enough of those natural resources that we are exporting today for our own requirements 10, 20, 30 years ahead? So these are the things that we have to look at and regulate these exports. But otherwise, I think a lot of our natural resources we are exporting. Does that count for trade? I don't think so, really.
Mr. Ali, I'm going to ask you a question that slightly stretches the brief and what we used to call out of syllabus in school. We have America now deciding that Trump might, by the end of this week, pass a law that stops H-1B visas at least temporarily. And we've seen him sort of make these noises regularly. There is a point of view, mostly on social media, that we've sort of messed up international relations because right now we're looking at all of our neighbors, sort of adversarially. Even though we've said that we're closer to the US than we used to be, we've had situations like this. If I were to ask you to assess our international relations on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the best, are we worse off or better off? How does a normal Indian citizen understand where we are right now?
Well, as a neutral observer, I think there are a number of factors that have come into shaping international relations the way we see it today. Firstly, a lot is happening over which we have no control. We're not that big a player. It's the Americans and the Chinese who are the big players. The Russians have also slipped in priority. So as the world is changing, people are, re-evaluating their alignments. They're again trying to link up with other countries. And we are seeing, for example, some of the, traditionally what are called middle countries like Turkey, etc., hopping closer to the Chinese, maybe, straining their links with NATO. So things like that are happening, which are not circumstances that we can control. But as far as we are concerned, I think our relationship with the United States, with European nations by and large, including France, Germany, etc., are pretty good. I think that in our neighborhood, maybe we've had some problems, and I would say successes and failures. Sri Lanka, Maldives, they're bright spots. Bangladesh, we have a good equation. Myanmar, we're doing pretty well.
Post NRC, do we still have a good equation with Bangladesh?
Yes, I think by and large we have a good equation. Sheikh Hasina, you see, one thing I would mention. You mentioned Trump. I mentioned Sheikh Hasina. Sheikh Hasina, Trump, Modi, they're all nationalist leaders and they're pretty strong. And so their interests, their country's interests for them are important. And I think when we look at the actions that they take, whether it's H-1B in the United States or NRC by us, that is a factor that comes in, that they're looking at their concerns. And of course, their electability. They're all in democracies. So that also is a factor. But I think there is a good equation between Bangladesh and us. Certain elements in Bangladesh may be unhappy about the NRC, but by and large, I think on a broader level, the relations are quite good.
Well, I have slightly taken up far more of your time than I had asked for, but I'm going to ask you one last question. For citizens who are nervous right now, because we've had such a spate of bad news in the last 3-4 months. COVID has happened, the economy is really struggling, people are losing jobs. Over and above that, to hear Pakistan is violating ceasefires in various parts of the line of control, and then China on the other side, there's a sense of gloom and doom. If you were to communicate to all these people right now and tell them what you really think the situation is like, would you assure them that things are not so bad?
I would say that things are not so bad. And I certainly hope that things improve. And here I feel that, what we have to see is the economy, actually. If that starts lifting, the people's spirits and mood will lift. But Pakistan, I think we must put into its perspective that it is, since its in creation, it has been anti-India and it will continue to be. It's a problem that we have to live with. Maybe someday it's sorted out, but it's a problem we have to live with. The closer that they are getting to the Chinese, the more volatile they become. At the moment, this gloom and doom, we are seeing the troops on our northern border, etc. It will pass, I'm sure. I mean, at the worst, we will have a conflict, we'll have a showdown. But I don't think it'll, and there are two opinions always among economists. If there is a showdown, your economy should pick up. That's what they say, because your manufacturing will go on. On the other hand, people say it will be a setback. So I don't know what is what. But if you look at the US model, their economy picked up with every war. So
that's because they're specific manufacturers of war. This
so
is what they specialize in. We don't buy war from
UK. UK, in fact, got their factories going at that time during the Second World War. So it depends. I mean, I don't know. I'm not that well briefed on all this. But I think we should look at the coming years with hope. I think it will come up because you can't keep a country like this down, and we have so many young folks. I think that will be the place from where the nature comes.
Right. Mr. Ranade, thank you so much. You've been very patient and very kind. I really appreciate this conversation.